Ideal Matriculation Higher Secondary School. Good morning, my dear students. Session 11, Class 7th Standard, Topic Unit 1 Prose, Either, Section 3. Next to the sweet shops, there were a few hardware stores and jewelry shops. The boys were not interested in anything there, so they walked ahead except Hamid. It occurred to Hamid that his granny did not have a pair of tongs. Each time she cooked chapatis, the iron pan burned her hands. If he bought her the pair of tongs, she would be very pleased. She would never again burn her fingers. It would be a really useful thing to have in the house. In this two picture, the first picture is tongs and the second one is iron pan. In this passage, the author conveys Hamid and his friends moved next to hardware stores and jewelry shops. His friends were not interested to buy anything in those shops, so they walked from there. But Hamid didn't move. He thought that his grandmother had not a pair of tongs. When she cooked chapatis, the iron pan burned her hands. So he decided to buy a pair of tongs for his grandmother, and then it would never burn her fingers. He thought that it was really useful to her and loved him more. Next passage. So Hamid stopped to look at a pile of tongs at the hardware shop and asked the shopkeeper how much for this pair of tongs. The shopkeeper looked at him and replied, "It is not for you. Is it for sale or not? Why should it be not for sale? It will cost you 6 paisa." Hamid's heart sank. "Tell me the correct price," he said. "All right, it will be 5 paise. Take it or leave it." In this passage, author conveys Hamid looked at the pair of tongs and asked the shopkeeper how much the pair of tongs were. The shopkeeper looked at him and said that it was not for him. Hamid asked whether it was for sale or not. The shopkeeper said that the cost of tongs was 6 paisas. On hearing the cost, his heart stopped beating and asked the correct price of it. The shopkeeper finally said that it would be the cost of 5 paises, and whether he wanted it need to pay 5 paises, otherwise asked him to leave that place. Next passage. Hamid said, "Will you give it for 3? Then he walked away, afraid the shopkeeper would scream at him. But the shopkeeper did not scream. On the contrary, he called Hamid back and gave him the pair of tongs. Hamid carried it on his shoulder as if it were a gun to show it to his friends. Mohsin laughed and said, "Are you crazy? What will you do with the tongs?" Hamid flung the tongs on the ground and replied, "Try and throw your water carrier on the ground. It will break." In this passage, the author conveys Hamid asked the shopkeeper whether he would give it him for 3 paises and then started leave from that place because he was afraid of the shopkeeper's screamed face. But the shopkeeper didn't screen him. He called Hamid and gave it for 3 paises. He was happily carried it on his shoulder. He showed it to his friends as a gun. Mohsin laughed at him and asked whether he was crazy and also asked what he do with it. Hamid threw it on the ground and told him to throw his water carrier on the ground. Mohsin, never do it. If he did it, it would be break. Mahmud said, are these tongs some kind of toy? Why not? Replied Hamid. Place them across your shoulders and it is a gun. Carry them in your hands and it is like the musical instrument carried by singing monks. My tongs are like a tiger among toys. In this passage, the author conveys, Mahmud asked Hamid whether it was a kind of toy. He asked, why not? And also added that it placed them across their shoulders. It was a gun. If we carry them on their hands, it is like a musical instrument carried by singing sage. He compared his tongs to the toy of tiger. Next passage. Sami, who had bought a small tambourine, asked, will you exchange them for my tambourine? It is worth 8 paise. But Hamid would not. The pair of tongs won everyone over to its side. By 11, the village was again filled with excitement. All those who had gone to the fair were back at home. Hamid too returned home. As soon as she heard his voice, Granny Amina ran out of the house, picked him up and kissed him. In this passage, the author conveys, Sami wanted to exchange his 8 paisas worth tambourine. He asked Hamid, but he did not ready to exchange it. The pair of tongs was more attractive than the other toys. The clock struck 11 o'clock. The village was filled with excitement. The villagers were returned to their home. Hamid also returned to home. On hearing the voice of Hamid, his grandma ran out of home. She picked him up and kissed him. Next passage. Suddenly, she noticed the tongs in his hand. Where did you find these tongs? I bought them. How much did you pay for them? 3 paisas. In this short passage, the author conveys, she noticed that he had a pair of tongs on his hands. She asked where he found these tongs. He replied that he had bought them. Grandma asked how much he paid for them. He replied that he bought it for 3 paise. Next passage. You are a stupid child. It is almost noon and you haven't had anything to eat or drink. Couldn't you find anything better in the fair than this pair of iron tongs? Hamid replied in an injured tone, you burn your fingers on the iron pan, so I bought them. Granny was deeply moved by Hamid's selflessness. She started crying. For the wretched woman, the pair of tongs was as precious as sacks of silver. In this last passage, the author conveys, Grandma scolded him, a foolish boy, because he didn't eat or drink from morning to noon. She also added whether he could not find anything better than that. Hamid replied in a sad tone. He said that she would burn her fingers while she was cooking chapatis. So he bought this for his lovable grandma instead of eat or drink. His grandma started crying and hugged him. For the poor woman, it was a precious gift than a sacks of silver. My dear students, I hope you understand this session. This is the end of the first unit prose. See you tomorrow. Thank you so much.